We are in the book of Mark, and we're in chapter 6. We got a little ways down into chapter 6. It's a little bit of a lengthy chapter, and so we may not be able to complete it tonight, but we'll move a little ways. There's several kind of interesting historical background kind of things in this particular chapter that we can talk about, and so maybe our topics and our discussion a little bit tonight will be maybe a little different than some of them we've had thus far. I want you to pick up with me in around verse 13 or so. I didn't quite get finished Sunday talking about the commendation that Jesus gives His apostles. He sends them out in 2 by 2 in pairs, right? He sends them out in pairs, and He gives them the power to do miraculous things, to cast out unclean spirits. You note that at the beginning of verse 13, that's then what they went out and did, and that they anointed with oil many that were sick and healed them. It's interesting, this anointing with oil has a diverse meaning depending on the circumstance and the environment in which it's being spoken. But it's interesting that they note both of these aspects. They anointed with oil and did what? And healed, which to me seems that the two are two separate actions. The anointing didn't necessarily bring about the healing. And generally, the anointing with oil was to bring what? If you were ailing, sick, comfort, right? It was a comfort measure. If you recall, there were times even when those would come to Jesus and do similar kinds of things in order to provide comfort and benefit unto Him from the weariness of the work that He was engaged in. And so as these apostles would go out, they would not just simply heal, but they were bringing measures of comfort and benefit to those who were challenged in various infirmities and difficulties that they had. But the point, I guess, very generically is that now you don't just have Jesus doing the very things to draw the attention so that people will then listen, hopefully, to the message that's presented. But now you have His apostles doing the very same kinds of things as they go out and begin to become the ambassadors for the work that Jesus has for them to do. And so more can get done. More people can be reached. Greater influence can be wrought. And it appears obviously then that Jesus is starting to reach a point in the process of His work where He wants a wider audience of people to be able to come into knowledge of who He is and what He's about. And because of that effort of bringing more people into the information, knowledge of who He is, who hears about Him? And King Herod does, right? So King Herod hears of Him, for His name was spread abroad, right? No longer just Jesus speaking on His own behalf. These apostles have now gone out, and the message of Jesus is being spread abroad, and King Herod hears about it. And he said what concerning Jesus? That John the Baptist was risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in Him. And then that's going to lend us to a history lesson from Mark as it relates to how John the Baptist lost his life to begin with. It's interesting that Herod is troubled by this notion. Did Herod, maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, but did Herod really want John the Baptist to be put to death? No, and we're going to see that in a moment. And I suppose that when he hears about Jesus and the miracles He's performing and the power that He's wielding and the things that He's accomplishing, it's making Herod nervous, because if that really is John the Baptist brought back to life, where's he heading? Is he coming to look for me? Is he coming to have a conversation with me? And so you can understand the trepidation that is probably going through the mind of Herod. But others said, no, it can't be John the Baptist. Maybe it's what? Or whom? Maybe it's Elijah or Elias in some translations. Or others said that it's one of the prophets, or as one of the prophets. It's interesting, by the way, when Jesus comes to His immediate disciples in a later piece of history, He asked the question, whom do men say that I am? And what was the disciples' initial response? That's the exact same thing, right? And so this concept of who Jesus was, that he was either maybe John the Baptist brought back to life, or maybe Elijah, or maybe one of the other prophets, this has already been conversed among people. And so when Jesus asks this question, whom do men say that I am? Those immediate disciples simply just tell him the very same things that they've been hearing other men say, concerning him. And then the greater question Jesus asked them is what? Who do you say that I am? And that's when Peter said, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. So this idea that Jesus has got to be some great holy man of some sort who's been brought back to life to serve in this capacity, because they don't want to believe he's what? The Messiah, the Son of God. They do not want to commit to that notion. Because the minute you acknowledge he's the Son of God, what do you have to do? Yeah, you've got a responsibility to that commitment. And so you've either got to commit to that realization, or you have to push it aside and say he's not really that, he's got to be something else. And so that's happening among Herod's mindset. And so he's kind of accepting and thinking about the things that others are saying. But when Herod heard, verse 16 thereof, he said, It is John whom I beheaded. I don't want to hear that it's Elijah or one of the other prophets. I'm telling you, it's John whom I beheaded. He is risen from the dead. This is bothering Herod. He's concerned about this. And he can't get out of his mind the idea that this has got to be John coming back to cause me trouble after what I did to him. And there seems to be a very deep concern on his part. And the reasoning is then given. Verse 17. For Herod himself had sent forth and laid hold upon John, and bound him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. So we begin to get a picture now of what it is that created this whole trouble to begin with. And Mark gives us a record of it. Mark gives us kind of a history lesson of what went on that precipitated or brought about the death of John the Baptist. And the problem surrounded the idea that, or the reality, I should say, that Herod had taken whom? Brother Philip's wife. And John the Baptist had told him, verse 18, it is not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife. This isn't right. And not only is it not right just from a moral standpoint, it's not right from the standpoint of the law. It breaches really, in some senses, two aspects of the law in relationship to him having his brother's wife. You've got that issue, and then you've got the adulterous issue that you can look at as well. And so this is troublesome to John. And what I appreciate about John is John wasn't afraid to what? Yeah, he wasn't afraid to tell the king the truth. I mean, I'm sure it, and again, I can't speculate to what's going on in the heart and mind of John, but I would imagine that could not have been an easy thing to do. To have to number one, to even say it to begin with, and have to speak the truth about that circumstance. But to the king, the one who can control your very life in his hands. But John knew this isn't lawful. This isn't right. And he goes and tells her, you can't do this. You cannot have her. She belongs to whom? She belongs to Philip. She's Philip's wife. And so he makes this statement. But who gets mad about it? Yeah, she does, right? The wife is the one. I found that fascinating. And you keep reading here, you're going to find that Herod actually tries to appease John. He tries to do all kinds of things to try to because he recognizes John as a holy man, as a man of God, and so he doesn't want to disrupt that kind of circumstance. But it's Herodias that's really upset about this. And she had a quarrel against him. And would have what? would have killed him, but she could not. I think when you read the rest of this narrative, you will find that it seems to me that Herod's the reason she could not. That he is protecting John from at least that extent of Herodias' anger. And I think you'll notice it as we read on here. That this wasn't about, because she is the queen in a sense, and so she would have had certain levels of authority. And I can't help but believe that she would have had men who answered to her, and if she had just in an arbitrary way said, I want John the Baptist's life, then they would have had to respond to her request. The only one really that can block that or hinder that is Herod the king. And so he seemingly here, as we'll see in a moment, protects John. For Herod what? Verse 20. Feared John. Okay? Herod heard what John had to say, didn't necessarily do anything about the exact circumstance, but he's afraid of John the Baptist. He knows John the Baptist is a man of God, and I'm probably got some problems here. This is going to create some difficulties for me. And so Herod feared him, knowing that he was a just man and an holy, and observed him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. Let me read from just a couple of different translations in verse 20, just to give you a little bit of a better definitive understanding from this text. Young's literal. For Herod was fearing John, knowing him a man righteous and holy, and was keeping watch over him. There's the implication I was telling you about. That King James, it's a fair word, by the way. It's a fair translation to say observe. But when you think of observe, what do you think of? Yeah, it just kind of watching it though, right? Just kind of, not really active, just something you're observing, you're watching. You might go into some classroom sometime and you say, I'm going to observe, but you may not be a student, you may not be the teacher, you may not be particularly active, but you're just observing what's going on. It's a little more, the original word is a little more meaningful than that. He said, and was keeping watch over him. He was keeping him and protecting him from the anger that had been kindled in Herodias. And having heard him, was doing many things and hearing him gladly. In other words, Herod wasn't ignoring everything John was teaching and saying. He was just ignoring him on whether or not he could keep Herodias as his wife. He was attempting to, in some senses, do some things that maybe he felt would put the scales in the right balance. But it was never going to be enough so long as he continued in that relationship that was unlawful. He could do all kinds of things that John had instructed him in. He could have followed all kinds of rules and regulations that maybe John would have shared, but it wasn't going to change this circumstance and make it all better. He was still in violation of the law, no matter how much of the rest of what John shared with him he followed. And I don't want to dive too far into this, because that's not our study here. But I see a lot of that in more modern times as well. Where the idea is, well, we know this is unlawful, but can't we do enough over here to compensate for that which is unlawful? In other words, I don't want to change any of these relationships or circumstances that are unlawful, but can't I do enough things on the other side of the scale that'll kind of balance it out? And the example here is no, it didn't change. Herod was still responsible and still guilty of a breach of the law, no matter what he might have observed or heard or reacted to in relationship to John's teachings. And so you've got this weird kind of relationship. You've got Herodias, mad as a hornet, ready to strike at John if she could at any moment that she could but she couldn't. And it appears that the reason she can't is because her husband, who she really shouldn't have, is protecting the very one that is causing the strife. Now, I want you to think about that. I've seen some challenged relationships. This has got to be interesting, right? To say the least. To think that the guy who spoke out boldly about your relationship, and she's mad about it, but he's protecting him, and he's the only roadblock to getting rid of him. And then in comes the birthday party. And I'm cautious not to be overly speculative because we're not given the details concerning all of these actions. We're not given all the exact motives, but I think some of them can kind of be seen when you look at the results of what happens. And I find it curious. When a convenient day was come, that Herod on his birthday made a supper to his lords, high captains, and chief estates of Galilee. So the best of the best, right? The elites of the elites are all gathered together around Herod to celebrate his birthday. And when the daughter of the said Herodias came in and danced, it pleased Herod and them that sat with him. The king said unto the damsel, Ask of me whatsoever thou wilt, and I will give it thee. So, by the way, as I understand it by custom, this would not have been necessarily out of the ordinary. As I read even this afternoon, there were even some historical documentation that even among some Jewish circles where dancers at a party, and we conjure imageries of that, and we just assume no one would ever do that. But in a lesser tone, it was something historically that had been done. You can go back and look at history and see that it was not uncommon for them to have somebody come out and dance at a gathering like this. Now, was it always lascivious? Was it always meant to entice? Was it? I can't answer that. I don't know. I'm kind of assuming that's the reaction here, but let's be honest, that's an assumption we're making. We're assuming that this had some kind, because he doesn't say that. He doesn't say she came out, danced lewdly, and he lusted out of his mind and made her the offer. That's not the language here. It's just she came in, she danced, and he what? Yeah, he loved it. He loved what she had. Now, again, I'm willing to accept that there's probably some things that aren't appropriate here. It's unusual, by the way, that the queen would send her daughter in to be the dancer for this party. And so there's probably some conniving going on in behind the scenes. Who knows what the history of Herod and these parties has been? I'm speculating, but I would kind of assume that this isn't the first gathering he's called for in his life. And the kinds of events that would have probably been involved in other gatherings that he's held. But irregardless, it is fascinating that she would let her daughter be the pawn in her game. And she allows her daughter, she is so vindictive and so angry at John the Baptist and so frustrated and determined to have him killed that she would use her own daughter in the method. And so, again, careful not to overread because we don't have a lot of the details. But we do know that she danced, and whatever kind of dance it was, it pleased him and everybody that was there, and he makes her an offer. Whatever thou wilt, I will give it thee. And then he went one step further in verse 23. What did he do? Yeah, well, but let me back you up to the very first phrase. he swore unto her. The moment he swore, what is he? He's locked. He's locked. And it's interesting. I have always found it interesting that there have been characters like Herod who, on one side, recognizes a circumstance in his life that ought not be, unlawful. In many senses, recognizes and admits to what John is saying about that circumstances is right. Won't do anything about it at all. But make a vow and break it? Not a chance. Even though it means another man's life who's innocent, and you know he's innocent, and you know the only reason this is even happening is because you married a woman you shouldn't have married, and she hates him and she wants him dead? It's really fascinating that he would be willing to maintain a vow to that extent, but wouldn't just handle the circumstance to begin with. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah, yeah. I yeah. I have read somewhere this expression is used in an effort to illustrate that I'm basically willing to give you what you ask, and in some senses, even if it's significant. I thought, to be honest with you, his rule comes from where? Ultimately, who's he answer to? Yeah, he answers to Rome. I didn't have to. I wanted to research and just ran out of time today. That would he have even had authority to give away half of a province that actually belonged to Rome? Which I'm not so sure. And again, I'd have to go back and look. But hopefully I'll get a chance to do that before Sunday. But at any rate, you may be right that this is more of an expression, not necessarily a reality in the sense that he would have had a right to give her. But what he's saying is, I'm telling you, whatever you ask me, I'm going to give you. And even if it's something bold and extravagant, I'm going to give it to you. And he makes the promise, or the swears to it. And so here again, let me just food for thought, and again, just something to think about, because I'm sure we've read this history and know this history. But she went forth and said to her mother, what she asked, or what does the daughter ask the mother? What shall I ask for? Now, again, I'll try not to be overly speculative here, but just think out loud with me for a minute. Well, I get to think out loud. You got to think quiet. But if she knew what the mother's intent was from the beginning, does she ask the question? I don't think so either. I don't know that she... and what my point is this. I think the daughter's a little bit in the dark as to what the intents of the mother might be here. And what her role in this whole situation. What's all this about? And why is he offering? And so she comes, what shall I ask? And she said, the head of John the Baptist. Again, it's interesting. Maybe that's overly speculative. I don't know, but it just seems curious. If she had been full privy to this plot or this purpose or what her mother might have been working at here, then she could have just what? Yeah, as soon as he said it, she wouldn't have had to go ask her mother what it was. But it's obvious who's making the decisions around this place. Herodias is making the decisions, and I think that she's even a thorn in his side a little bit when it comes to things and the pressure she's brought to bear on him. I can't imagine how many times she's probably asked for John the Baptist's head and been rebuffed. But now what do they have as an edge? Yeah. Finally they have something that he's committed himself to that he can't back away from. Yeah. If these men around him, well, let's just read on. So she runs straightway back with haste, it says, unto the king, and asks, saying, I will that thou give me by and by in a charger the head of John the Baptist. And the king was exceeding sorry. Again, my further implication that his relationship with John was better in some senses than you might think. And he has put him in prison, potentially for what reason? Yeah, and to plead, but maybe also to keep him safe. It could potentially be the only place that if he's roaming out and about, where would you generally find him? He was the voice crying where? In the wilderness, okay? I mean, and his residency in that, he would have been pretty exposed to any kind of plot that she might. So again, just food for thought about this whole circumstance. But just to me, it's always been fascinating, this kind of circumstance. So Herod doesn't like this at all. He is exceedingly, it's bothering him. But yet for his oath's sake, and for their sakes which sat with him, he would not reject her. Again, I'm almost somewhat under the impression here that had no one else heard him make this promise, he may have what? He would have said, no. That's not what I had in mind here. But he's made an oath not just in front of her, but he's made an oath in front of the chief, most elite captains and rulers. And if it gets out that Herod can't be trusted, that his word doesn't mean anything, he has eliminated his ability to influence and rule over that province in the way that he would want to. And so he can't. He made an oath, he swore by it, and for those who sat with him, he would not. And immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought, and he went and beheaded him in the prison, and brought his head in a charger and gave it to the damsel, and the damsel gave it to her mother. I'll just let that go. Isn't that amazing? I mean, yes. Yeah. And there's enough disgust to go around in this whole scene. The depravity of people sometimes. But yet, here we are, a couple thousand years later, and the depravity sometimes that people choose, the behaviors people choose are still as deplorable at times. And it's sad. But here, the predecessor to Jesus, the one prophesied that would come. We think about the cruelty and the sadness that surrounds the death of Jesus, and obviously that's absolutely true. But there's a tremendous amount of sadness and cruelty and lack of any moral fiber that surrounds the death of his predecessor as well, as John went about trying to set the stage for the coming Messiah. And this is his fate, because he spoke up about the conduct of the king and had the courage to do so. All of this eventually comes. And so his disciples heard of it. I mean, can you only imagine? Now, these are John's disciples, by the way, the folks that have been following him. When when his disciples heard of it, they came and took up his corpse and laid it in a tomb. And the apostles gathered themselves together unto Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And so keep in mind, that sounds strange because we weren't dealing with chronology. Now we're back in chronology, if you will, because what happened, if you recall earlier in the text, how we got into this conversation to begin with was the apostles had gone out, had begun to spread the word of Jesus. The message about Jesus had gotten back to the ears of Herod. He thought that Jesus was John the Baptist back alive, and then we reel back in history and we talk about the events surrounding the death of John the Baptist, and then after we hear the history, now we jump back to where we were in historical time as it relates to the work of the apostles and the things that they were doing. And so they come back and report, basically. They come back and report to Jesus the things that they had encountered and the things that they had taught and the challenges that maybe they had met along the way. Just one more thought, and then I'll quit on that segment. But it is interesting that Mark decided in the record that he wanted to put this piece of history in the record. That he could have just simply said, word got to Herod about Jesus, and Herod thought he was John the Baptist, and he could have just went on and stayed within kind of the chronological narrative that he was providing. But he felt this was a significant enough piece of history that he wanted it recorded as it relates to what happened to John the Baptist. Comments, thoughts about any of that piece? All right, so the apostles have now come back. And what's Jesus say to them in verse 31? Let's take a break. It's exactly what he says. He says in verse 31, he said unto them, Come ye yourselves apart into a desert place, and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure, so much as to eat. Even when things are important, even when your work is essential, there are times you got to step away from it and take a breath, get something to eat, take a moment of leisure so that you can then recharge your body and mind and then go back to the work. Go ahead, Ed.
We looked at Jesus. He was in a body like we have.
Yeah.
And he really got tired.
Yeah.
I don't know how he kept his pace.
Yeah, and the Bible would seem to indicate very clearly that his body was no more superior than any other man's. That his body experienced the same weariness, tired, hungry, all the same experiences that anybody else's human form would experience. In fact, when Isaiah prophesies about his coming, he talks even about that there's no form or comeliness about him. There's nothing peculiar about him. When you would see him, literally, he would look very much like everybody else. And so he's experiencing the weariness. His apostles have just come back from this time span that they've been out doing the work they've been doing. And Jesus says, we got to take a breath from this. We need to step away from this scene for a little while. So they departed into a desert place by ship privately. And the people saw them departing, and many knew him, and ran afoot thither out of all cities, and outwent them, and came together unto him. So they're doing everything they can to get a break. But he's too what at this stage? He's too well known and too popular. Too many people were able, not everybody, right? But all it takes is one or two in a particular village or community to recognize him to what? Yeah. You can hear him yelling running ahead, right? Getting ahead of him, outwent him, getting out in front and telling people, he's coming, he's coming, he's coming, right? And so it was hard. it was hard for them to even attempt to privately go off and find a place of rest where they weren't dealing with the throngs of people. And so Jesus, when He came out, saw much people and was moved with compassion toward them because they were as sheep not having a shepherd. And He began to teach them many things. And so Jesus said when He came, I came to seek and to save that which was lost. And so when He looks out among this audience of people that He experiences here, and He sees them, He's moved with compassion. He feels for them because they obviously were sheep who had no guidance and leadership. They had no direction. In some senses, they didn't even know what they were looking for. Here's, they've heard about this one who's performing these miracles, and they're just kind of flocking at the next, exciting thing that has come to town. And so here they are. And Jesus looks and He's concerned about them because they needed leadership. They needed people someone to guide them. And undoubtedly the difficulties of the Jewish traditions that had kind of given way rather than observances of the law as it should be. They're disconnected from Jerusalem, where the immediate leadership would have been. So there's all kinds of reasons why folks in this area would have felt lost and in need of some. So as He sees that, He begins to what? There at the end of verse 34. To instruct them. It's an important little lesson, by the way, right there. When people are starved for leadership, part of leadership is to be in what kind of mode? In a teaching, instructive mode. Leaders have to offer instruction. They offer teaching and guidance to circumstances and situations, and they expound not. That's what Jesus did. I find it interesting that we're basically told that they were as one without a shepherd, and His response to that was to teach them and to give them instructions. Leadership can come in many forms, and leadership requires the ability to do a variety of different kinds of things in order to lead. But here's a perfect example of Jesus illustrating that a shepherd, a leader, needs to communicate a message, and in particular the message that comes from God's Word. It's a requirement, if you will, of effective leadership. And Jesus demonstrates it Himself in that moment. And so for the day is now far spent. His disciples came unto Him and said, this is a desert place, and now the time is far past. So the whole point of going to a desert place was in hopes that what? It will get some rest, and maybe if it's kind of deserted, no one will follow us. Surely let's go somewhere where nobody else, they won't want to come there. We're not going to be in a city itself, but as they were trying to privately kind of travel to a more deserted, less populated area, people saw them doing that and just walked out into the deserted place with them and followed them out there. And so now He sees them lost. They're willing to walk clear out into a desert and not know where they're going or what they're even doing out there. No wonder He looked at them with compassion as one as sheep without a shepherd, sheep without leadership, because they were willing to just keep walking out into the desert, not knowing anything about why they were doing that. But now the day's gone. They're in a desert place, and His disciples say to Jesus, send them away, that they may go into the country round about and into villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. You ever been somewhere maybe you're not very familiar with, and you're hungry, and you can't find anything. You would settle for anything, right? You would settle if they had an old country store. You'd stop, and whatever they had would be fine because you've got to find some place, right? Well, they're so secluded and so there's nothing. And Jesus says that there's not even, you're going to have to send them away so they can get out into the villages and into some areas where they can find some way to sustain themselves and buy themselves some bread, for they have nothing. In other words, they didn't pack a lunch as they saw Jesus come by and say, well, we might be out there a while, we better take some provisions with us. None of them really are doing that. So we got to send them away. They can't stay here. And he answered and said unto them, give you them to eat. It's another one of those statements that Jesus made. Remember, he's made those kinds of statements to them before. It's similar to me. It's similar to the statement he made when he asked them who touched his garment. When the woman who had an issue of blood for 12 years touches his garment, the power left him, and he knew that, and he says, who touched me? And his disciples say, what do you mean who touched you? Everybody's touching you, right? Everybody's pressing against you. How can we? And so this is a similar kind of question. You can almost see the expression of the disciples face. What do you mean give them something to eat? They said to him, shall we go and buy 200 pennyworth of bread and give them to eat? Or are you saying we should go into the village and create enough provisions and get enough food so these folks can have something to eat? And so he said to them, how many loaves have you? Go and see. How much you got? And when they knew, they say 5 loaves and 2 fish. That might feed him and his disciples, but it's not going to handle this multitude of people. It's not going to handle the necessities of what's happening here. But he asked, they told him, and he commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon the green grass. So they said some of them sat by 50 and some 100, right? So in other words, don't just, I appreciate it's as simple. Jesus is going to perform a miracle, right? He's going to perform a miracle that takes 5 loaves and 2 fishes to feed all these people. But I am always fascinated in the fact that Jesus always seems to want men to do their part. What was their part here? Get in groups, okay? Don't just stay all dispersed all over the place. I mean, if Jesus wanted to, he could have just went and there'd have been bread and fish in everybody's hands. But that's not what everybody's got to do their part in this. And Jesus seems to show that on numerous occasions. It reminds me a little bit, if you recall, when he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. And so he's got the power to raise a man from the dead. But what did he ask the people standing around to do? Roll the stone away. Now, could Jesus have miraculously rolled the stone? Sure he could. But he says to men, because they could do that. That's a responsibility they could handle for them. They couldn't raise Lazarus from the dead, but they could roll away that stone. They may not be able to take 5 loaves and 2 fish and feed the multitude, but they can't help organize and put them into groups so it's simpler to take care of. And so when he had taken the 5 loaves, verse 41, and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish divided he among them all. And they did all eat and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments and of the fish. I've seen this depicted in movie scenarios sometimes, and I can remember one. I don't even remember which particular movie version of this story it was, but to me it grasped a little bit of what must have been going on among this crowd as they could kind of see what they started with, and then as they began to disperse it, it just kept going and going and going and going, and when they were all done, they've got baskets of leftovers. You would have thought that 5 loaves and 2 fish in a multitude, there wouldn't have been a crumb left. But Jesus feeds them all to the full. And then some. And that's really who Jesus is. If we'll trust Him and put our faith in Him, put our confidence in Him, from a life standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint, He will give life more abundantly. And we'll have more than we need to sustain and carry us through. And I don't just mean that from some kind of physical standpoint, although He cares for us in that way too. But His focus ultimately becomes the spiritual condition of man. And there's plenty to fulfill our lives through the Savior. And they that did eat of the loaves, verse 44, were about 5,000 men. So the audience is at least about 5,000, but that, sorry ladies, that's just kind of the way they did things. They counted the men and made some assumptions. It's basically how they would do a crowd numbering. They would count the men and then assume certain numbers as it relates to others. But the implication of that is, number one, they didn't walk through the crowd and go, 1, 2, all right, everybody count off and zigzag back and forth till they got about 5,000. The point is, an enormous crowd where there were 5,000 just of men and obviously then women and potentially children and others that were present during this period of time. And straightway He constrained His disciples to get into the ship and to go to the other side before unto Bethsaida, while He sent away the people. And when He had sent them away, He departed into a mountain to pray. Tried to get to a desert place, but too many people saw Him trying to get there and just followed Him. So Jesus feeds them. He puts His disciples on a ship and says, you guys head toward Bethsaida. He tells the audience, you've been well fed. You can now, you've got enough sustenance so you guys can go home. And He heads into a mountain to pray. He finally gets the solitude and the moment of rest that He originally was seeking to begin with. And it took Him going up into a mountain to pray. You wonder a little bit in my mind whether He figured, I've tried everything else, right? I've tried going on a vessel and crossing and people followed. And I've tried privately to walk into a more deserted area, but enough people saw me, recognized me, and followed. Maybe if I climb up this mountain, then folks will just go on home. And so it seems that He finally has found a way to get some privacy, to get a moment of rest, and ultimately to get to communicate with who? Communicate with His Father. I want to come back to that thought. Lord willing, we'll finish chapter 6 on Sunday so you can answer the questions to chapter 6 because we'll review through them. But I want to focus for a few minutes on the human side of Jesus here, who though He is deity made manifest in the flesh, He's at this point, I don't want to say He's communicating with the Father exactly like we, because we communicate to the Father through Him. And so, but yet, the idea here is that He's communicating. The word pray is used. So think about that a little bit going into Sunday, how He's using the same mechanics that we have extended to us about how it is that we can pray or communicate to the Father. So Lord willing, we'll come back, finish chapter 6, talk about that for a little bit, and then answer the questions to this chapter. And by the way, I forgot to. I was going to mention this earlier. I'm leaving this one up here because I kind of got caught off guard a little bit the other day trying to remember parallel text. Where where one event might be re-recorded in a different. So I've got this. This is my cheat sheet to leave up here so I can refer to it when I need to. If you would like a copy of this, I'll get it. I'll get you one. Just come see me. But basically, it's just a harmony of the Gospels. It basically is just a chart, and it shows you what the event is that's going on, and did Matthew record it and where, and did Mark record it and where, and did Luke record it and where, and did John record it and where. And so it's handy if you're trying to figure out where things match up and not. And none of these are necessarily perfect. There's even some thoughts as to whether things match up. But anyway, here's one. If you're interested in, come see me, and I'll make sure you get a copy of it.